Have you ever wondered if an entire country's economy could just collapse, like overnight, with no war, no warning, no big disaster, just a sudden, terrifying freefall that throws an entire generation into a decade of pure survival? Well, it's not a what if. It's the story of the Great Depression.
And this, right here, says it all. This captures the brutal, whiplash reality for so many people. We're not talking about a slow decline. This was a violent, shocking event. Imagine that. Fortunes, hopes, entire family legacies that were built up over a decade of good times, just gone. Poof. Vanished in the time it takes to get from your morning coffee to your evening meal.
And to put a number on it, here's the scale of the damage. Adjusted for today's money, over $200 billion in wealth just evaporated. And look, this wasn't just numbers on a stock ticker. This was people's homes, their life savings, their entire futures. A loss this big doesn't just happen out of nowhere. So you gotta ask, how did we even get here?
Well, to understand the crash, you first have to understand the party that came right before it. And boy, was it a party. We're talking about the Roaring '20s, a time when it felt like the good times were just never, ever gonna end.
See, after World War I, the American economy was just on fire. Factories that were making tanks switched over to churning out all these amazing new consumer goods. The Model T was rolling off assembly lines, and by 1929, 10 million homes had radios, blasting jazz and new ads right into living rooms across the country.
But here's the thing. This party wasn't for everyone. While the cities were absolutely booming with new skyscrapers and jazz clubs, out in rural America, it was a totally different story. Farmers who had done pretty well during the war were now getting crushed by falling crop prices and huge debts. So you had this growing divide, right? Urban wealth on one side, rural poverty on the other, and it created a really fragile foundation for the whole economy.
And the absolute heart of all this city mania? It was Wall Street. It basically became a kind of Disneyland for adults. And the magic ticket to ride all the rides was something called buying on margin. This let pretty much anyone buy, say, $100 worth of stock with just $10 of their own money. The logic was simple. Hey, stocks only go up, right? What could possibly go wrong?
And this just brilliantly shows you how insane the speculation got. Suddenly, everyone was an expert. Your barber, the shoeshine boy, the bellhop, they were all dishing out can't-miss stock tips. Your barber might still be cutting hair, sure, but in his head, spiritually, he was a full-blown tycoon.
Now, a few people did try to sound the alarm. There was this one economist, Roger Babson, who in September of 1929 flat out warned everyone a crash is coming. But in a country that was just drunk on optimism, his warning got completely drowned out by the sound of popping champagne corks. The party, as you can guess, was about to come to a very, very abrupt end.
You know, every party has to end sometime. And when this one did, it didn't just end quietly. It ended with a crash that would echo for an entire decade.
So it all started on what they called Black Thursday, October 24th, with this huge wave of panic selling. Then, after a little bit of a rally, the real collapse came, Black Tuesday, October 29th. The market didn't just dip, it went into a complete and total free fall.
This quote just perfectly captures the sheer violence of it. It wasn't a gentle slide, it was a final, brutal plunge. You have to imagine the chaos. Ticker tapes just spitting out an endless stream of falling prices, the roar of the trading floor turning into shouts of pure panic, and grown men literally fainting from the shock of losing everything they owned in a matter of hours.
And the mood out on the street was just pure shock. People were just standing there, staring at the ground, trying to process how an entire decade of unstoppable optimism had just face-planted into a brick wall and taken everybody's life savings with it.
But the crash on Wall Street? That was just the beginning. The shockwaves quickly spread out from the stock exchange to every single street in America.
Okay, so the crash set off this catastrophic chain reaction. First, brokers made what are called margin calls, basically demanding investors immediately pay back the money they'd borrowed. When people couldn't, and most couldn't, they were totally wiped out. This led to bank runs, as terrified people rushed to pull out their savings, which caused thousands of banks to collapse, taking the life savings of millions down with them.
And of course, with banks and businesses failing, jobs just disappeared. By 1933, the unemployment rate had skyrocketed to a staggering 25%. I mean, think about that for a second. 1 in every 4 Americans who wanted a job simply could not find one.
The human cost was just immense. In the cities, you had bread lines that snaked for blocks and blocks. Teachers were reporting that students were fainting in class because they hadn't eaten in days. This wasn't America starving metaphorically. The country was starving, literally.
And as if the economic disaster wasn't enough, an ecological one struck the Great Plains. Years of really aggressive farming and a massive drought had turned the topsoil into dust. And I mean giant black blizzards, dust storms, buried entire farms and forced millions of people to flee west just to survive.
The suffering got so widespread that it actually developed its own dark language. President Herbert Hoover, who many people felt was doing way too little, became the namesake for all this misery. So shantytowns were called Hoovervilles, and the newspapers people used for warmth at night were called Hoover blankets.
And maybe the absolute lowest point came in 1932. Thousands of World War I veterans marched on Washington. They were peacefully asking for an advance on a bonus they'd been promised. The government's response? They sent in the army, which used tear gas to drive them out of the city. It felt like the country had literally turned on its own heroes.
The nation was just broken. It was desperate for a new direction, for a new leader, and for a new plan. And in March of 1933, it got one.
In his first speech as president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke directly to the nation's despair. And this famous line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," it wasn't just a nice speech. It was like the first deep breath the entire country had taken in years. It signaled a huge shift from being paralyzed by fear to taking real action.
And FDR acted fast. He launched this whole series of programs we now call the New Deal. You probably heard of them. The CCC, the WPA, the TVA, the FDIC. This so-called alphabet soup of agencies put millions of Americans back to work building roads, dams, and schools. They weren't just rebuilding the country's infrastructure, they were rebuilding its pride.
And slowly, but without a doubt, life started to stir again. The economy, the GDP began to rise. Unemployment started to creep downward. In places like the Tennessee Valley, new dams brought electricity to entire regions for the very first time. And families started gathering around their radios again, not just to listen, but because they finally felt like they had a future to listen for.
You know, the Great Depression didn't really end with a big celebration. It ended with hard work, with blistered hands, and with a nation choosing piece by piece to get back on its feet. But just as America's factories were roaring back to life, a completely different kind of storm was gathering across the oceans, a global conflict that would demand even more from a generation that had already given so much.